So we have Glenn Renfro, Roy Clarkson, and myself here presenting today on the Spring update. I'm a committer on the Spring integration as well as the Spring XD projects at Spring. Working for Pivotal, which is previously Spring Source, now then VMware, now Pivotal, and committed to a couple of other projects on the side. So, but yeah, that's me. Glenn?
I'm Glenn Renfro. I also work with Roy and Gunnar. Work on Spring XD, which now is Spring Cloud Data Flow, and Spring Batch, Spring Cloud Task, and wherever else they kind of need me. So that's where I'll be contributing to.
I'm Roy Clarkson. I'm one of the organizers for the Atlanta Spring User Group, so we might have some people here. We created a meeting on that meetup page as well, so if you're not part of the Spring User Group, then check us out. We don't have as regular meetings as AJUG, but we try to get some good Spring content out there. See, I went to Georgia Tech. I've lived in Atlanta a long time, but I recently moved to Birmingham and drove over here just to see you guys. But I work for Pivotal as well, and I'm currently working on the Spring Cloud Services project, and we'll talk about some of that in the presentation.
So basically what we want to talk today is kind of like give you a little bit of an overview of where Spring is these days, what's new happening, and do a few demos around that. Let's put it that way. Is anybody not using Spring in their daily work or in their projects? Few hands. All right. So, what are you doing? What are you using in your projects? Just getting.
We've been using Quit just on Tomcat, but we're just now trying Spring for some REST API and OAuth. So just basic getting our feet wet.
Okay.
Great. Not really in production yet.
Oh, nice. Okay, cool.
I'm just learning. So.
Hey, that's the best thing. Yeah. Thanks for coming.
We're using Spring 4, Spring Data, Spring Security. We're just getting the MVC stuff with it.
So you're on Spring 4?
Yeah.
Are you using boot at all?
No.
No? Okay.
No, we were on Spring 3.2 and we just moved to Spring 4 like 3 months ago.
Okay.
So we really haven't, we just did the migration. We haven't done any, and thank you for the migration being easy. So, so we haven't actually used any of the robust parts of Ford just yet, but we're looking into it. But, yeah, we use Spring Data. We have Mongo database. So,
are you still doing XML configuration, or have you converted to the?
Say that again.
Are you still using XML configuration, or have you converted it over to Java config?
No, we're still using it.
Okay.
So it sounds like most people, at least some Spring experience. Were there any hands that did not use Spring yet? Just to yes.
Oh, didn't use Spring yet?
Yes.
Or.
Oh.
He's not using it presently.
Okay.
Right now.
All right.
I think that's because he doesn't like Spring.
Okay.
We worked together before, and where we worked together, we used Spring extensively.
Okay.
And it was awesome.
In Scala, it's just not so popular.
Oh, yeah. Okay, understand. Yep. All right. Cool. Just want to scope the landscape a little bit. Just a slide of actually what Spring is. Originally, dependency injection framework. Rod Johnson did his famous book, and then the Spring, just this core Spring framework itself, and then 2003, and then from there, it grew in terms of ecosystems. I mean, all kinds of different projects sprouted out around it, and this is kind of like what we have today. So we have the foundation layer, kind of like Spring framework, Spring security. We have support for support for the groovies. Then projects around Spring Data for database and relational and non-relational data access. And then a whole bunch of higher level projects around it, like Spring integration, implementation of the enterprise integration patterns, batch for batch processing, Spring Web, and then on top of that, kind of like service, projects like Spring Boot and Spring XD for stream processing, and then of course also the Spring Cloud project. So in this talk today, we're probably focusing a little bit more on kind of like what's new around Spring MVC. Also capture a little bit on the whole thing around Spring Cloud. What is that? So that focuses a little bit on those projects around it. And just to give you an idea of how, even like more finer grained how those projects are, is if you take a look, for example, at Spring Data, it's not just about JDBC, but there are modules for JPA handling, RESTful services, Mongo, Redis, and then there's a whole bunch of also community supported or provided services as well. Looks like I made a mistake. We'll fix up. There's some buttons on the bottom. Sorry about that. Spring Social, right? If you need to integrate with Twitter or Facebook, etc., get data out of those. So we have provide that project, which is quite handy. And I mean, just look at the community provided projects that are out there. So if any of those, if you need to integrate with any of those services, there's some building block out there you can grab and use the Spring programming model with that. And then, of course, Spring Cloud, but we will talk about that.
Yeah, one comment had the Spring Cloud, it had just a regular box on there, which is probably our slides, but the box probably needs to be about something about this big now. Would you say?
Yeah, we actually created a whole new GitHub org just for Spring Cloud, because it's become this big umbrella project for a number of different sub-projects as well. So.
We'll talk more about that in a little bit, but let's talk about the Spring framework.
Yep, so basically, there's a whole bunch of projects out there that whatever needs you may have, we will provide. We have those. So if you take a look at Spring.io, that's the project website that has access to all of those projects. And we just came back from Spring 1. That was middle of September, Washington DC. And so those were basically like a whole week of just geeking out and coding slides 24 hours before the talk was, stuff like that. But
these jackets.
And we got those jackets, yes. So it was really awesome, and also to talk to all our fellow engineers, which we only see kind of like once a year, basically, since we all otherwise work in our caves back home. Basically a whole bunch of news happened this year. We had the release of Spring Boot 1.3 that we cover in a little bit. So Spring 4.2 was released early this summer. Maybe a good question. Who's using Spring 4.2? 1, 2, 3, 3 people. Spring 4? Who's on Spring 4? Right, that seems to be a larger crowd. Spring 3? Right, looks like.
Spring 2. All right.
Spring 1. You should migrate, if you get a chance, you should probably migrate to the later Spring releases rather quickly or swiftly. I think, particularly if you're using Spring 3, I'm not sure. Forgot what the.
In the block is?
Yeah.
It's tough for a little while, but the transition from 3 to 4 is fairly smooth. And one of the things we're going to talk about is that one of the primary goals that's going to come out, as you're going to see, is that we're going to have a 4.2 release, which is already out. There's going to be a 4.3, which is going to come out sometime, I think, second quarter next year, and maybe first. I think it's second quarter. But then there's going to be the Spring 5 release. It's going to come out in 2016. So, yeah.
So, I mean, just be aware that when you upgrade to Spring 4 or 5 or whatever, sometimes you might need to deal with the Jackson version as well. Because we had issues with, you know, Jackson with Spring 4 was not compatible with the prior version, you know, you just cool.
Yeah, that's certainly a dependency that, I mean, typically the upgrade process should be fairly straightforward if you don't use anything that's, deprecated, stuff like that. But yeah, there's every now and then you have to hit like a snag, not necessarily because of Spring, but because of some of the dependencies like Jackson. That
Right, my point is that you don't necessarily, Jackson doesn't necessarily get dragged in with the 4 upgrades.
Right.
Sometimes you have to explicitly set the version of Jackson and other dependencies.
In your main palm or your Gradle. And one of the things is that I also recommend is like, as a community, when you're using Spring and you see that we come up with a milestone or an M1 or M2, if you want to just, throw one of your projects and just try it, and then kind of open up the GitHub issue saying, we hit this, Jurgen watches it like a hawk. And so they will respond fairly promptly. So the thing is that, to kind of make your transition smoother, give it a shot. That's one of the wonderful things about the open source. I mean, it's literally, when you do write up issues out there, we are listening, we are watching. And not like we're some kind of evil entity, but we do watch these lists, okay? So yeah, contribute back just by issues. Those are great for us.
So that actually brings up a really good point, though. There's another feature of Spring Framework that we offer called the Maven Build of Materials, and that's a parent POM, essentially, that you can include in your project, and we've fixed all the versions of all the dependencies that we know work really well. So that means you don't have to go in to your project and specifically declare all of those individual versions. So if you're using Spring Boot, you kind of get this because Boot's handling all that for you. But if you're not, even if you're not using Spring Boot, you can include this BOM or build of materials in your project without Spring Boot, and that will fix all of the versions that we know are compatible with each other, that we're building with, that we're testing with.
Yes, sir.
Just as an aside, the reason that I'm hit a ceiling with Spring 3 is because I am using Spring Dynamic modules inside of Apache Carafe, and 3.2.1.1 is the highest version that will support, unfortunately, which is bad because I love Spring and I don't want to have to part with it, because I'm working in an OSGI container, and I almost feel like I have to make the decision, like, do I want to do OSGI or do I want to do Spring?
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
Sorry.
No, but I feel your pain regarding that. But yeah, the OSGI support, certainly that was something that was pretty much left, I guess, making that switch from 3 to 4.
Is there any chance that relationship can be rebuilt, or is there? I hope I'm not bringing up something that's a sore subject or anything, but I mean, like, is there any chance of a future with Spring and OSGI together, or maybe there was a reason that you decided to not do that? Or?
It's a good question. I don't know that I know all the reasons that we moved away from it.
If it's
You guys-
you don't want to go down right now.
Yeah, well, it's not necessarily that. It's more like that the Spring Framework project made that decision. And while we do contribute to the framework, we are not the technical. We are what we call committers. Sure. And like I commit to XD, Dataflow, Batch, and these guys, Spring Cloud Services and Gunnar, whatever I work on, Gunnar's worked on that more. But we're not the committers to that. But there was, I don't know if they documented why there was a gap in the OSGI or why they.
But yeah, ping us after the talk. We can exchange information, then we just follow up what we can do.
I mean, we can certainly communicate your use case back and say, look, I'm stuck here, and maybe we can get some information about how to proceed if you wanted to lessen the pain to try and start upgrading or something like that. So, sure.
All right, Spring 4.2. An interesting introduction they introduced with 4.2 is the alias for annotation. I think probably the big takeaway from 4.2 is like a whole bunch of refinements. Nothing like in terms of like where you say like, you know, it's like a massive feature, but there's a ton of like smaller refinements that are within Spring 4.2. So if you have running if you're running on 4.0 whatever and you need to upgrade to 4.2, I think it should be a fairly smooth upgrade experience. The big alias for basically what that does is it allows you to basically create aliases for, you know, you basically have this meta annotation concept where you can basically take multiple annotations and create your own annotations combining the functionality of other annotations. So for example, if you're running, for example, like we had one for a couple of internal ones. For example, if you do Spring MVC and you do a request mapping and you then do an add response body, for example, you know, we now have we introduced at some point an annotation for add rest controller, right? So that basically just combines two annotations under the covers. But occasionally there were issues of attributes within those annotations that are basically either overlapped or you wanted to rename them, etc., customize that functionality. So you can do that now with add alias for. So there are a whole bunch of those annotations that were retrofitted. So that's one little thing, and that also in Spring 4.3 that might be used to provide more default annotations as well, to make it more easier or more visually, you know, what the intent is there. Hibernate 5 support, that's certainly a good one for enterprise developers to finally have that full out-of-the-box support for that. So if you want to use that with Spring 4.2. There are a couple of JMS improvements, and then of course support for, you know, money, currency, formatters, conversion services. I think that's lots of the stuff that came with Java 8, for example. That should be all supported. Yes, we did. Oh yeah, and composed annotation. So they're basically, if you want to check out what you can do with this stuff, so there's Sam Brennan has a repo where he's basically putting in a couple of experimentations, what they want. Also, if you want to provide feedback of what would be useful for you, that should go into the core framework with Spring 4.3. Check that project out. There's a whole bunch of support for improvements regarding testing in Spring 4.2, like support for HTML unit. You can do now Selenium WebDriver integration. Small little thing that's, you know, every now and then you wanted to you had to use at rollback annotation, but you didn't want to do the rollback. You want to commit actually. Now there's a commit commit annotation. The context cache is now a public API. That might be if you need to tweak the way how the context is cached between testing. You know, there's no ways for that. Inline SQL is not a possibility with add SQL. So if you need to execute scripts, etc., as part of your tests, you can do that.
Actually, I just remembered one thing about the annotation improvements coming in Spring Framework is I was speaking with Rob Winch, who's the project lead for Spring Security, and he's really excited about this because what this means is you can have annotations that are more fine-grained for security. He's not going to necessarily provide them out of the box in Spring Security, but what it's going to do is allow you as the developer to create annotations that are like, you know, allow admin and users with these privileges or something. You can compose those annotations and inherit, the security features of other annotations, and it's going to be a really interesting improvement for Spring Security and being able to annotate specific methods with those securities.
There's also now a way to initialize the Spring context as part of using JUnit rules. So if you, for example, instead of do the Spring way of do the at run with, and you rather want to use some of the JUnit provided one, you can do that. So like in this case, parameterized class, and using that color was not a good choice. But basically, in JUnit, you have a couple of different runners. Like, for example, I did an interesting one with using parameterized tests in JUnit, where you can basically create your own little parameters for unit tests. So you can create one unit test, but it feeds basically a whole array of parameters, which then basically execute that test multiple times. And I use that for testing security rules. Across all the URLs, a couple of HTTP status responses I was expecting, etc. And I used a parameterized test, which worked quite well for that. So now you can also have the ability to initialize your Spring context this way in your unit test. So. Embedded DBs. That's has always been a little bit, anybody who has done JDBC testing every now and then got a little bit, might have gotten frustrated that if you run JUnit tests that your database was still sticking around. And you had to do ways to basically, clear it out or
change a port every time you ran. So
basically, yeah, do kind of like magic to funnel that around, because those whatever, even if you use an embedded JDBC or database like H2 or HSQL, basically they were created based on the Java virtual machine, and since they would not shut down entirely, so so now you have the ability to create or generate a unique name. So with that you basically can, even though you would create multiple DBs, you wouldn't have run into those issues of collisions, whatever, with the database tables. If you have, basically have to throw away data and repopulate that, and
it's really good for like integration-based tests.
Yeah.
And we hit that a lot on like Spring XD, where it wouldn't shut down and we'd get a failed port in use, and so we had to create our own. This is a couple of years ago. We had to say alter the port and just choose a random port, and even then, once in a blue moon, you still get a failure. But with this, it kind of clears that up, so you don't have to build that special behavior. You just use what you have.
Spring Web adds a whole bunch of new stuff. If you're doing WebSockets, the SIMP user registry might be kind of interesting. So it allows you now to keep track of users. If you basically Spring MVC provides really good support for WebSockets and a couple of abstractions around that. So basically, when users connect to your service, in certain cases, you may want to know who's actually connecting to your services. Maybe you need to interact with those users that are connected. So there's no support with that in Spring 4.2. There's some async support improvements, adding of OK HTTP for the REST template. So that's a project by Square, and that allows you to basically it's another HTTP library. Previously, we used we're using by default the Apache HTTP client for the REST template, and that's another choice. They provide support for HTTP2 Speedy, as well as they allow you as an HTTP client to be used without change from Android as well as in Java. So So that's a fairly popular choice out there. So if you need that, that's in there. JavaScript templating support, that has been added. HTTP caching, that's a neat one.
So we have mentioned a few JDK8 features, but JDK8 is not a requirement for you running Spring 4. So.
No, it still supports Java's 1.6. So so that's not a requirement, but it takes advantage of whatever is provided in Java 1.8. So or Java 8. So including default methods, you can use lambdas, etc. And lots of the Java 8 features are fully supported in Spring 4.2. HTTP caching control, if you need to fine-tune whatever data you return for your MVC applications, that there's now a dedicated cache control builder out there. So set the various properties on that. You can do that either globally for your web config, and you extend the web MVC configure adapter, or you can also do that on a per controller. So for example, you can return the a response entity, and on that you can also set the cache control properties as well. And also integrates with eTag. Anybody using eTag in their Spring MVC apps? All right, nobody. That's basically a way to pretty much cache the response from your client to the server. So basically, if you use, for example, an eTag filter, if it determines that there is no change in the contents that your client already has, it will not send the data over the wire back to the client. So basically, there's an HTTP header, an eTag, kind of like a hash on your data. If it's the same, don't return it. So it provides support for that. It's kind of useful. Cross-origin resource sharing, also course. That's a really nice feature in 4.2 that have explicit support for that you can fine-tune that. An area you will run into if you have, for example, provide RESTful services and you need to have support from other clients having access to your REST endpoints. You may run into the cross-origin issue, and now you can basically set that inside of your controllers, either on the class level. You can do that also on the method level. So similar to when you set request mapping, so you basically have that little hierarchy going. So that support is in there as well. Async support. I mentioned before we have pretty good WebSocket support in the Spring framework, and not just the plain WebSocket support, but we also provide the abstraction layer. You don't want to use it directly, right? You want to, since it's not supported by the browsers, you may have firewall issues. Mobile clients may suck supporting it appropriately. So you want to use something like you want to use fallback methods, right? So we provide SockJS as a supported fallback mechanism, and then on top of that, you don't want to use just a simple messaging either, right? So you want to use maybe something like we provide stomp support. So basically, it's kind of like similar to if you use JMS, whatever. So you basically can have full-blown messaging support on the client side, or other connected Java endpoints. So it's not just browser, but it could also work Java client-wise. So that you can basically send messages, different queues, topics, and have that full support. So we provide that. And Spring 3.2 we had like async request handling support. 4.0 that was a big theme there where we provided the SockJS and Stomp support. In 4.2 we also provide now HTTP streaming, server sent events, and direct streaming. Server-sent events is kind of interesting because it works actually over HTTP, so it's not its own protocol like WebSockets, so it should technically work much better, and it's much simpler. So if you don't need the bidirectionality of WebSockets and you literally just need to send push notifications down to your connected clients, server-sent events might be a really nice way to do that. And it doesn't suffer from those incompatibilities that you might still run into with WebSockets. So in this case, just normal request mapping, return an server-send event emitter, and you can use that. And all this stuff is also fairly well documented in the Spring documentation and/or the Spring blog. So, if you need further information, check those out. For 4.3, there are a whole bunch more refinements, polishing planned. I mentioned earlier the composed annotation, the pre-composed annotation support. There will be a couple of those annotations that will make it into 4.3. So that's the next step there. And then the next big thing will be Spring 5, and that will be planned for Q4 2016. And that's kind of like right on the basically, it will coincide with the JDK 9 release. So depending.
When we'll be ready before the 9 or.
Yeah. And it will basically also then have a Java 8 baseline. So if you, there's still support, and 4.2 has long-term support, right? So it's not like if 5 comes out, we have to upgrade. But make sure that you have in your plans to also upgrade your JDK versions. I know there are plenty of people that's still on Java 1.6. Plan, I think it's end of life now, right?
Yeah, I don't think they can't put 1.6 on.
So basically, what we want to do is we wanted to basically take advantage of those Java 8 features, even like in the core framework itself, more closely. So that's basically what Java Spring 5.1 is going to do. Servlet, improved servlet support, HTTP 2 support, and a huge thing that will come in Spring 5 is reactive support. So it's all the rage all over the place. You need to be reactive in whatever you do. It's probably not really something that you have to use in all circumstances, but we will have comprehensive support. It will not replace Spring MVC support, etc. However, it will be very, very much closely integrate with the current Spring MVC configuration we have. So it will provide a very similar configuration experience out there, but it's still like over a year out there. So look for it. I added a link to a repo, Spring Reactive. There are a couple of presentations out there as well, slides and ideas of how that is progressing. So if you want to follow that, so you can.
Yeah, I'm actually really excited about this. Some of the preliminary conversations going on about the reactive support. The programming model is going to be very similar to Spring MVC. So if we're not going to ask you to try and learn something totally completely different, but a similar programming model is going to allow you to do something that's functionally quite different and in some ways more powerful. So, very excited about it.
And with that, is anybody doing like reactive programming in your projects? Doing using RX Java, those type of things? Yeah. What are you using?
Actually, they're using RX Java in an Android project right now.
Okay. Cool. That brings us to Spring Boot. Who's using Spring Boot? Well, a few hands.
Experience good so far?
Basically, anybody that does not know what Spring Boot is.
I know a little bit, but if you could give kind of a little bit of an overview. I just had the idea that it's basically kind of pre-packaged set of dependencies that all play nice together, but I have a feeling there's a little bit more to it than that.
Basically, maybe just a few things of history. I mean, originally Spring was very heavily on XML support, right? So you had your application context, you configured via XML. Spring, increasingly, particularly like with was it Spring 3, whatever, and we started adding more annotation support, kind of like also going more down the road of providing sensible default in however you're setting up your applications, including Spring MVC. Spring Boot basically takes that to the next level in a sense that it maximizes the amount of defaults to the extreme possible. It's basically an application. It's kind of like I guess basically almost like as a framework on top of core Spring, right? So it's kind of like a runtime for your applications.
I guess historically Spring has been very agnostic about all of the libraries that you can use. We try and support lots of different things. We say you can use this if you want to use this. You can use this template technology if you want to use it. Whatever database you want to use, here, you can go do these things. And with Spring Boot, we decided let's kind of flip that around. We get a lot of questions about, well, what's the best way to do this, or what way do you recommend for this as the Spring team? And so Spring Boot provides a much more opinionated application building experience that auto-configures a lot of the settings that you might have had to configure in the XML previously. Now it just takes care of those things as sort of default settings. And you can always go and change those if you need to. But there's a lot of things that we realize to get started with, you don't need to know how to configure all these different technologies. You just know that you want a database. So you add the database dependency in there, and then we wire everything up for you. And it just works.
Well, and even to that point, he says you just wire in your database. That includes the connection pool. Like out of the box comes with Tomcat connection pool. But if you don't want to use that and you want to use Apache, so you can just change the configuration, and there you go. And by default, let's say you're using AHSQLDB or even Postgres, it's just going to go localhost into the correct port. So the goal is that you can have a basic app up and running, and just literally just a small POM file, a main, and some auto-wired data source, or auto-wired features. So the goal is to get you kind of bootstrapped into so you can go straight to code, and then as you start building on that, you can set up your YAML file, which is it can support properties and YAMLs, and even at that point profiles. So you have this whole suite of what Spring offers, but instead of you having to try to pick and choose what you want, you can just say I want to use Postgres, I want to use I'm trying to think of other stuff. I'm just stuck on databases right now. But I'm going to, I want to hook into AMQP and I want to use Rabbit. And so you can actually, all you have to do is have like 3 annotations and a couple of auto wires and you're running.
Like for example, also if anybody, if you use configured Spring MVC in the past, it could get somewhat wildly, right? I mean, you have like all those different, from view resolvers, ways where you static resource, all that kind of stuff. It might get a little long. Spring Boot pretty much takes it away to possibly even to 0, right? So it has like those things that are, you spend some time to find out what would be the best approach for your MVC application. They basically rolled it into some pre-configured mechanism that is already built into Boot.
My favorite one is just to go look up a tweetable app.
Yeah, basically the easiest one was like you could tweet a Boot app, and it would work basically as an MVC application.
So another major feature of Spring Boot is that it builds a fat jar of your entire application, and that jar is then runnable via either the Spring CLI or via Maven plugin or Gradle plugin, and you don't have to deploy it to an application server. There's an embedded Tomcat within the Boot application, and you can just run it.
And if you don't like Tomcat, you can switch it out with Jetty by just changing your POM and entering your POM file.
So
that's basically like, yeah, that's basically, you know, you can still deploy to a software container if you want to as a WAR file, but also a big thing is that it gives you the option to just run, basically use Tomcat or Jetty, etc., as a dependency in your project, and just have an executable jar that just runs, allowing you to do a whole bunch of customization on the Tomcat engine as well. So that's you know, particularly when you move towards like this microservices world, etc., where you know, you just treat basically your container as just another library dependency on your project itself.
And and I know for a lot of you are using it, but I mean, Groovy Grails is built on boot. You know, we took XD on boot, and so there's several large apps that are running on boot right now. So it's kind of a tried and true system.
Another huge thing about boot is the configuration options you have, like in Spring, I think it was in 3 already, right, or 4.0, the environment abstraction, right, where you basically you get access to the environment within your Spring application and the environment object, and it basically gives you access to your system properties, your environment variables, you know, custom property sources you can configure within your app, and they also follow a nice hierarchy. So that was a really nice introduction in the core Spring framework. In Boot, they took that a step further, where they actually provide a centralized, a standardized way of how you configure your application. So lots of the defaults you can override, not just by custom code if you really need to, but you can actually just provide custom property support within the boot application. So it just becomes another configuration property you provide to change certain behaviors within your app. And with that, you also have configuration classes support. So you know, if you basically wanted to use the environment and basically inject it, you know, in certain, let's say in your service layer, right, you needed access to property A, B, whatever, but it would still be a string of that property, right, which is great, but may not necessarily be you know, change resistant to change. You know, Spring Boot also has support for where basically certain properties can be grouped into a class with getters and setters that basically represent properties, and then you can inject those classes into your services or whatever you're using. So you're not having a magic string you need to deal with in the application, but it's basically something that you can refactor and manage in one central place. So that's kind of like, yes.
So with respect to the embedded container for Spring Boot, like I was facing major problem in terms of debugging as a developer. The only way I had to debug is like put a system of like SOP and then figure out what is the issue. I mean, I cannot use any IDE to put a debug point there and then okay, it directly point to the.
What do you mean with Spring Boot?
Yeah, the embedded containers, like embedded Tomcat or an embedded.
It's basically just like debugging a main application. Yep. I mean, you basically just debug when you import your project, let's say in SDS or IntelliJ, etc. I mean, it's basically just a main application. I mean, that's basically the big advantage of Boot, is that it's just a main application. That's all you run basically, and you can just debug it as, you know, any other application. So there shouldn't be any issues. I mean, ping us afterwards. You know, we can.
I think almost everybody on the Spring team is using either IntelliJ or our Eclipse distribution, which is Spring Tool Suite, and both of those have fairly solid support for Spring Boot in them now.
And we'll point out some of the stuff that's coming out in the latest, or that's in SDS, for example, to show you some of the tooling support there.
Yes, sir.
So when you produce the executable jar and it launches the embedded container, do you have a flag to switch on like JMX connectors and all of that to flip it into debug mode? You know, like an easy option?
You can enable the JMX, but I'm not sure you can do that hot. I know that you can disable?
You can. There's the config. Like for example, we have the that's then some of the stuff actually also even goes into the Spring Cloud stuff. Like there's config server support. We can actually.
That's config server. I'm just talking out of the box.
Well, it kind of like goes into that realm, right? You can basically refresh properties within Spring in Spring Boot, where you can basically like. Well, you can go so far as to say like, well, I have to change certain properties within my app at runtime, and you basically have a refresh endpoint on the boot application that you can yet you can enable and it's secured and all that kind of stuff, and basically refresh those properties. There's a refreshable scope you can set up, and you can even use it all the way down to like refreshing data sources. For example, if you need to change your database password or whatever. And do that at runtime.
Yeah, the config server is really good about that.
Hmm?
So like you could switch up the actors that you're supporting? I'm just thinking how far you can take this forward, quickly staging like a test environment.
I didn't understand. What was the question again?
You were talking about you could refresh at runtime.
Yeah.
Your Spring Boot application, like all these system properties and configuration.
Right.
Does that mean it would actually take down the embedded container like the Tomcat that's running on Jetty, reconfigure it and bring it back up with the new properties?
I'm not sure if you can take it that far.
I don't think so. I mean, I know that you can, like with the connection pool with config server, I know you can like bump up and increase like data, like the number of connections in your data pool. I know that you can do that.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure. I mean, that was one of the things that we kind of tested when we were playing with config server, which is part of Spring Cloud, and we had a boot app that hooked into it. Not sure.
But you technically can, all the normal application level properties you have there ways in there that you can refresh those at runtime. Okay. So there's support for that.
Really good question.
And
it is important to clarify, Spring Boot is not Spring Framework. It's not the next version of Spring Framework. Spring Boot is a separate project. Spring Framework is a separate project, and those two things aren't being combined or anything like
framework.
that. Yep. Yes, sir.
So I'm relatively new to learning this. My interest, I went on the website, you see all like the sub-projects they have for Spring. My interest was in creating something that was both real-time and scalable. So talking about mixing the different projects, my interest is obviously minimizing the amount of XML I need to dabble in. So Spring Boot, and maybe Spring MongoDB. They're allowed to play together, even though they're separate projects.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep, absolutely.
Absolutely.
So Spring Boot's going to provide what we call a starter POM, and you drop that into Maven, and it's the Spring Data MongoDB starter POM. And when Spring Boot sees that dependency on the class path, it's going to do auto configuration to enable MongoDB within your application. So you don't have to do any configuration on your own to get that up and working. You can, obviously, you customize it for your needs, but there's a default configuration that it's going to enable for you.
so the auto configuration is not just property settings that are defaulted, but also dependency auto configuration. So if certain dependencies are detected on your class path, they will automatically be set up for you in a default way for you within your application. Of course, customizable if need be, but those things are in Spring Boot.
Yeah, so I mentioned this idea of the starter POMs. We have a whole host of these different starter POMs for all the different libraries, third-party libraries that we support. So there's a web starter POM, for example, if you want your application to have Spring MVC support, and you drop that starter POM into your application, and Spring Boot just auto configures everything for you.
And also, just a reminder, this is not just for Spring MVC applications. So this is, you can use that in any type of Java application environment where you need, we would use Spring. Traditionally, you can also use Spring Boot as a runtime, basically. All right, and basically the pathway to no XML. So basically, even though we were traditionally heavy on the XML, we kind of like embraced fully annotation configuration, or the defaults, etc. So with Spring Boot, you can basically develop entire MVC applications that have not a single line of XML. So you can literally even get rid of web.xml if you know in your applications.
But you can do that with the Spring framework too.
You could, but you know,
yeah, just longer path, but.
So yeah, but if you are still using namespace support using XML, it's still also supported as well, and you can mix and match Java configuration and XML configuration. You just want to iterate that we're not deprecating one over the other. We favor more Java configuration these days, but you can still mix and match. You can, if you use XML configuration, you can import or use Java configuration, vice versa. If you have Java configuration, you still have XML context files around, you can import those as well.
This is actually a really good time to talk about initializer, if you wanted to show that web page.
Yeah.
So we have.
Yes, sir.
So when you mentioned NoSQL, right, like another issue which I face with pure annotation is Spring with AOP. It's still primitive. I still have to use AOP.xml and then put my regex saying anything that starts with whatever get start. It has to be a read-only transaction. The Spring transaction management using AOP. It's still XML. I couldn't find any annotations for.
Well, you just put the use the add transactional annotation to mark yours.
Not the direct transaction, but if I have to give some sort of a regular expression saying anything which matches update star method should automatically get a requires name or something like that. It's still through the XML.
I haven't used that in a while. That one I'm not.
Is he referring to are you referring to point cut expression?
Yes, a point cut expression.
What about the before and after and annotations that you can put those in?
But then for that I have to go and mention on every other method the point cut. I cannot use any regular expression before this.
That's a good question. I must admit I haven't used that those particular features in quite a while. That was actually probably my Spring 1 or early 2 days. Good point. Need to look that one up. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Ping us and we can make sure you get the answer.
So we were talking about Spring Boot a lot, and we have a page that's on the Spring.io website. It's I don't know if you can see it. It's start.spring.io, and what this is just a handy UI around generating either a Maven project or a Gradle project, and you can select which boot version. So if you wanted to check out the latest milestone of 1.3, you can do that, or use the latest GA version, for example. You can specify your group and artifact, and I've reworked this page since the last time I looked at it. Interesting. Okay, so as it says, you can type stuff in here, and then you can pick, for example, web. So if you want a Spring MVC application, and say you want JPA Hibernate in there, and what else? I guess that's enough. Okay, so then you can click generate, and what it's going to do is, Gunnar, this is your computer. I don't know where this.
And then.
So it's going to download a zip file, and
it's basically a running application.
It's a full application that's got the POM that's built for you. It's got so you can see it's annotated with Spring Boot application. It's got your main method. Essentially, this is a runnable application. It's got all the dependencies for building a Spring Spring Web. And Can you guys see that? No? So this is what I was talking about with the starter POMs. There's Spring Boot Starter Web and Spring Boot Starter Test, Spring Boot Starter Data JPA. So the JPA in the web, that's how Spring Boot knows how to what you want auto-wired or auto-configured, is that it sees those dependencies in there.
So that's a great way to just get started basically with Spring Boot. And
you can see sorry Gunnar, but you can see at the top up here the parent POM. That's the build of materials that I had mentioned before, or we use parent interchangeably, but that's the only version that we've got in this whole thing is that 1.2.7.release up there, and everything else are managed dependencies brought in from that parent POM. So.
And that's not just for Spring Boot specific dependencies, but if you use, let's say, any other libraries that you could think of, for many of those, you don't have to provide a version explicitly. So basically, they will inherit the
should have been tested to make sure it works, that there's no collisions. Like if you're using ActiveMQ, there won't be a collision with whatever else you're using.
And yeah, and this last thing down here, this plugin, this guy is what I'd mentioned a few minutes ago. You can actually run this application from Maven. It's Spring Boot :run, and it'll just run the whole application from the command line. And
we've also bundled it all up. So basically, any dependency libraries, whatever, by default, they will be wrapped into the boot app. Yeah, and I think we have that in our slides as well. So let's see. Talking about boot application adoption, that stuff is taking off like wildfire. It's really quite amazing. It's almost like besides the core Spring framework, just another killer app for us, basically, in terms of adoptions. And even like in places I'm originally from Germany, and over there they're like standards. So historically they've been very heavy on all the various JCP standards and etc. And even there, this stuff is taking over like wildfire in terms of companies finally looking into this to start their projects and do their projects. And we have some massive projects overseas, but not just overseas, but also other organizations that are adopting Spring Boot. I mean, China, right? If you don't know about those guys, Alibaba, there's some blog posts on the Spring blog. Some of the largest e-commerce websites environments on the planet.
Yes. Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Yep. Yep, that shouldn't be a problem at all.
Yep.
Yeah, XD is out the gate. Well, no, it's got that embedded Tomcat in it, but
yeah, there's another project that we have for that, Spring XD, Spring Shell. That probably is not bootified yet, but we actually have a project explicitly for shell support.
Usually
so
when I do like a demo for like a presentation or even like a project I'm working on the side is command line still. I'm working on a little device on the side and it's using Spring Boot. And I don't need a UI yet, so absolutely.
But yeah, it shouldn't prevent you to have complete shell support or shell-based Spring Boot application. It shouldn't be a problem at all. So yeah. Huge adoption there. I mean, just massive amounts of how they're using Spring in their environment, and they use it in connection also with Cloud Foundry. So just amazing. If you watch your movies, you're basically using Spring in whatever you're doing. It's really pretty amazing. I mean, when we talk later about the adoption of Spring Cloud, a whole bunch of those things got adopted. Basically donated by Netflix in their projects to the Spring Cloud projects, and they are really heavy user of Spring, Groovy, you name it basically. So and Spring Boot. So there's also I have a link at the very end of this for some resources on our YouTube channel there are also a whole bunch of presentations. I mean, just pushing out the presentation from Spring 1 of this year, and there are also a couple of presentations. I think one I saw yesterday by one of the by Netflix. They talked about how they're using it in their environment. So, some of the new stuff that's in Spring Boot 1.3. So, basically lining up compared to Spring Boot 1.2 with the latest Spring releases, Spring 4.2 and Spring Security. OAuth 2 supports in there. The feature I like a lot is a colorful ASCII art banner. So if you start up your boot applications, you get like a little your Spring Boot banner, and you can colorize that literally easily. And talking about like how defaults work in Spring Boot, you literally just have to put a banner.txt in your source class path. It will pick it up as a default banner, basically. So, and I have that as a demo later on. Another one, we talked about how we wrap the libraries into an Uber jar, into the jar, so that you only have one file to deal with. You can now also do executable jars, which this is kind of like, looks like magic. Basically, you can literally execute a jar as a shell script. The way it works is they use some proprietary thing that apparently some systems support. Basically, in the zip file, you basically put some bytes at the beginning of the file, whatever, and that gets interpreted. That also includes support for all the Linux services in a systemd, so you can use that to integrate the boot applications into your system if you run it locally on your system. So so I think that's a really neat feature. If you need that, I also like log file integration. I think that also puts it into whatever root var, log, etc. Just a disclaimer. You know, you may. It's a proprietary feature, not by us, but basically just how that works with jar files or zip files in general. So you may, in certain situations, may not work, but you know, it's there. And the way you can flip it is literally using the Spring Boot plugin. You can literally just make a Maven property saying make executable, yes, and it will basically make that for you.
So does that mean it's basically chmodding file for you?
Yes. So.
To give it executable permissions?
Yes. Yeah, I think it generates an executable file, basically, yes.
It's also playing the game in which the shell will look at the first n bytes of any file you tell it to execute and look for the interpreter to run, and it's pointing it to the Java interpreter.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a, yeah, it's a.
That's the magic.
Yeah, the first time I saw it was like, wow, that's interesting. So otherwise, there's a whole bunch of health indicators, actuators. One thing we haven't talked about in Spring Boot is you have a whole bunch of like you know, support services for your applications that you could use, like from and those are integrating into your security setup, etc., and you can run them on different ports. But you basically can have stuff like, well, give me what is, if you want to see what are all the properties my application is using, for example, memory consumption, you know, JMX properties, right? I mean, what is exposed from my app for configuration purposes? You have access to all those using actuators, and you can configure those in Boot. It's quite sophisticated, comprehensive support for all kinds of different ways in there. And in Spring Boot 1.3, you know, there's log file for log file actuators in there. There's even one for docs. Hypermedia support. You know, really, like in terms of having all those built-in configuration options for your applications. I mean, if you want to roll those yourself, I mean, that would be just I mean, it's pretty quite helpful stuff. That's basically for free if you want to develop Spring apps that are part of provided by Spring Boot. Also, Spring Session auto configuration. Anybody who has heard of Spring Session as a project? One. Okay. basically what Spring Session is you know, if you're running against one container, you know, the container is basically managing the session for you. You know, you don't, wherever that session is stored, whatever the container does that. If you want to do run in a cloud environment, or you have more than one app, and you know, you want to have some failover in a PaaS environment, and you're using you know, just Tomcat deployment, how are you dealing with the session? So basically what we provide is with Spring Session, that and that was done by Rob Winch, our the Spring Security lead. Basically, we abstract the session from the container itself, so you can now have access. Basically, basically by default, we're stored in Redis. So, you basically that way you can have just ordinary Spring Boot or Spring applications and have session support. So just bring multiple processes up there, as many as you want. It's totally independent from the underlying container, and you can still have session state provided to you. And Spring Boot has default support for more automatic support for that built in. But this also allows you, for example, is to configure session management, or how session information is provided, have more customization points. So, for example, you know, by default it's just a cookie, right? But you know, if you don't want to use a cookie, but for example use an HTTP header, Spring Session has support for that to manage that session information.
It makes it really easy to do. Like if you have Gmail and you got 3, 4, 5 accounts and you're all logged in at the same time, it makes it trivially easy to build an app where you have different users running in the same browser without stepping all over cookies, JSession IDs, any of that stuff.
Yeah, you can basically customize it to whatever you want. So it's not just if. Yeah, as you said, like if you have just one, typically you have one session per browser. Now you can have session per tab if you want to.
No more Apache sticky sessions. No more Apache sticky sessions required. If session.
No more sticky sessions.
You don't have
no more sticky sessions.
Oh. However you want to do it, right? So it gives you that flexibility. So persistent session support, Spring 1. Anybody using End? There's End support now, which is interesting. Then a whole bunch of annotation supports for for configuring servlets, filters, listeners. This one is interesting, quite useful if you're using Logback. I mean, Spring Boot has built-in fairly good default configuration for log files. So it actually provides you colorful logging to the console. Has a fairly decent support for how that is formatted. Also, you can configure log levels, etc., within the Spring Boot configuration file if you want to. However, if you want to have more control over how you configure logging, you can also provide custom logback configuration XML files to configure that. Interestingly, often you may want to run your application in different environments, right? So you want to run your application in standalone mode, but you may also want to push your application into a cloud environment, let's say Cloud Foundry, for example. And so you can now provide profile support in your logback configuration. So there's an additional element you provide in your logback config file that basically is a Spring profile sensitive. So you have, if the cloud profile is active, do this. If it's some other profile, configure use a different section in your logback configuration. And also you can have access to the environment properties in logback as well. So that's an interesting way of configuring your logging with Spring Boot. And also, who's still using Log4j 1.x? Nobody? Or not too embarrassed, maybe? Huh? That's not us, though. I'm sure there. I mean, I know that you could programmatically configure that type of stuff, but I'm not sure if you want to.
You could do a Groovy. You could use Groovy as
Yes.
well, and we've done that. So if you absolutely hate it, you can use a .groovy to set up lockback.
But but as I said, like if you have like a standard, just standard logging requirements, like, hey, I want to for certain for certain packages, I want to have info logging. For certain other ones, I have a one level. You can do that within the Spring Boot config YAML file, for example, or properties file, and provide those as well. So you don't have to use the XML for that.
That brings up a good point, though. I'm not aware of any project that is specifically removing any XML support. I mean, all of that support is still in Spring Framework. It's still in, the other projects. It's getting updated to be in parity with the Java config. So there's not a desire to, alienate people who want to use the XML support there.
Boot developer tools. Basically, who's using JRebel? Few hands. Basically, a tool for managing class changes. So if you make changes in your IDE to your classes, etc., config files, basically those are propagated and those classes are reloaded on the fly using JRebel. So there's some, not the full-blown JRebel support, but there's some support now we provide with the boot developer tools. That certain class changes are reloaded automatically. So that's in there. You can just declare dependency to the boot dev tools, and it basically is being activated. One neat thing is the support for live reload. So, for example, if you make a change for your view files, for example, that if you have the proper Chrome plugin, etc., installed in your browser, that the browser, you don't have to press the refresh button anymore. So it's kind of like it's reloaded automatically. So I think that's an interesting feature. I know if you're doing JavaScript development, you kind of like I used this stuff for years now, but now we also have it in the Java world as well. So that's a nice way there. Automatic caching configuration for various cache providers. That's in there.
That's pretty much all of them are starter Palm, Hazelcast, and I think Guava. There's with the Hazelcast and Guava. Well, Hazelcast, you have to make sure that you include the XML because that's the only way it knows where the hosted port are. Guava, I think with that we do require a version for that for their caching. And the same with InfiniSpan, so with Hazelcast you have to have that XML, but like EHCache, JSR 107 or any JSR 107, it's just starter Palm.
But yeah, whatever you use, there's support for that.
Pretty
nice. One thing I always want to, not necessarily 1.3 specific, just boot in general, which one feature I like a lot is that by default, whatever you push in your, everything is served, most recommended out of your class path. So by default, anything in your class path that's out of static, public resources is automatically served if you're developing web applications. What this allows you to do is basically kind of like create almost like modular jar files in your application. So for example, if you have a main project and you may want to ship it with or without the UI, just don't declare the dependency or declare the dependency and it's included in your app, and the UI is served. Where this is useful is if you're doing single page applications where typically what I prefer when I've developed those is use the JavaScript tooling that's provided to build my application using Grunt, Gulp, whatever you want to use there, and use that tooling. There is tooling available to make that happen with Maven, right? There's a Maven front-end plugin to build your client applications, etc. However, lots of the cases in the JavaScript world, like using NPM, Bower, etc., pulling in those dependencies, it's a little bit more flaky sometimes in terms of network latencies, etc. So that may have some implications onto your build itself. So you may want to separate that out, for example, have a separate build for that. But your main applications, your backend, whatever, if you want to bundle it up, for example, you can just declare dependency on that, in your local Maven repository, etc. Pull it in, and the UI is automatically served from, if you one of those paths. You don't have to do anything.
WebJars is very familiar to Java developers, but if you have JavaScript developers on your team, they're going to not really be.
So that's another option. So basically, you can also use WebJars. So basically, if you want to use just plain the JavaScript tools, which I think is the best way at this point to do it, but you could technically also use just kind of like just plug in use the Java world of how to deal with JavaScript, etc. And there's some support in Spring, but not as sophisticated as some of what you have in the pure JavaScript world. But there's WebJars support, which is a project out there that basically bundles JavaScript libraries, etc. as jar files, basically, and you can plug those in. And if you declare dependency in Spring Boot, those are automatically pulled in, and you can access those in a standard way in your applications.
Yeah, so if you're not familiar with those, you can basically just declare a jQuery dependency in your POM, and it gets pulled in, added to the resource class path. You can utilize it right within your UI.
So just as a quick example, I have presentation I did at the Spring user group last year. I forgot, or I get it at Spring 1, I believe. That I do. Oops. Target Botanica G. Where basically I'm using Spring Boot as to run basically a single page application. So basically in this case I'm having a gulp-based setup that does all the client stuff. I have a boot app that provides the RESTful services, and it's all bundled into one project using the Maven front-end plugin. So and I have a link on that to the resources at the end. So what this basically does is, small little applications where I basically have just a couple of pumps, plants, whatever, a couple of pictures here, pulled out from the back end. I have some basic security in here for we're using Spring Session. Then I can delete plans, whatever. Also have some ability to upload plans over to the server. And I also have, as an example, some WebSocket support, so that some of my plans should show up here in the UI as well. So yep, here we go. So those are streamed back to the client. So small little application. So if you want to take a look at that, one cool thing is I started migrating this whole thing to Gulp and TypeScript. So if anybody is using kind of like, if you do client-side application development and you don't like the just free-willy dynamicness of JavaScript, there's an interest coming out of Microsoft and also now supported by the Angular team moving forward is TypeScript, which is basically like a JavaScript with type information in there, which is kind of neat. So since we're running a little bit out of time, what do we have next? Yes?
What plugin do you use to bundle this two together?
Say again?
What plugin do you use to bundle this two together?
What do you mean? Which bundling? The JavaScript side?
The JavaScript side and the API side.
What I'm using is what works well for me is the just to get started is like the Yeoman. There's like it's just insane what type of tooling support you have on the JavaScript side for some of those bundlings, right? I mean, they literally bundle up the JavaScript, the CSS, the minification, even like the view templates, right? Like in this case, all the HTML you have in your single page application, they're all bundled together into a JavaScript file, and then basically just having one request, minimizing the amount of requests. So that's pretty wild. It's yeah. Take a look at the project Yeoman, and they're basically startup project for all kinds of different projects, including AngularJS that provide that. One quick note on migrating to boot 1.3 from 2.0, 1.2 to 1.3 is some of the properties have changed. So take a look at those and some dependency updates. Otherwise, it should be fairly straightforward. Just want to put that out there. Some release notes and what has changed that are out there, and also the property changes. If you're using STS, for example, there's property auto-completion support. So if you have wrong, incorrect properties, those will be highlighted. One quick note I want to make is in the Spring Boot application. If you have old applications that you need to migrate, and you're still using JSPs, for example, the actual boot documentation basically states that that has some limitations. I was able to figure that one out, that if you basically follow the advice of putting your stuff into meta-inf resources, you can also bundle your JSPs with a standalone jar file, so that works as well. So there was basic documentation. I haven't submitted the change yet to document it better. Right now, it still states that you cannot have standalone jar files executed with JSPs, but it actually works quite well. If you put it there, it's kind of like a standard in the servlet spec, so you can meta-inf resources, and then it works. Oh yeah, and just to as I stated earlier, you can eliminate with boot web.xml entirely. You have to do, however, a few customization potentially, depending of your let's say error pages, whatever you defined in web.xml. You may have to drop down to customizing the Tomcat setup directly, because there are a couple of things in web.xml that are standardized in web.xml, but there's no API that's standardized. So you have to do some container-specific configuration, but possible. Tomcat embedded servlet container factory makes it possible. And speaking of, actually, for our DevNexus app, which is a Spring Boot app, we historically have been using JSPs as our view technology, and that's how I spent some time on there to make that happen, because hadn't had the time yet to migrate those over to, let's say, AngularJS or whatever. So we're still using JSPs, and it works, and it's out there if you want to check it out. And for that one also I'm using oh, come on. Interesting. I think my laptop just gave up on me. Hello? Wow. Maybe I just need to take the hands off for a second. But that one also, we migrated it up to Spring Boot 1.3. So that's out there. If you want to check it out. And so talk about Spring Initializer. That's out there to get your project started. Developer tools, caching, demo migrating, JSPs, demo, tooling. Yep, mentioned like we have the property editor support in Spring Tool Suite, improved Cloud Foundry support if you deploy there.
Enjoy the boot YAML properties editor if you do YAML. Just enjoy it.
Yeah, that one is really helpful.
It's helpful.
Yeah, so I was actually talking to Gunnar earlier today about this, because I use IntelliJ and I don't have that editor, and he was showing me how awesome that is. So it does content assist or type assist on the properties files, the YAML file in the Spring Boot application. It's very useful.
Oh, and the Spring Boot dashboard is also quite helpful in terms of if you have multiple services within the app, and you basically, going more towards a microservices architect, where you have like multiple services, whole bunch of services within your app. You basically have like now, you can start multiple services at once. You have introspections into some of the boot endpoints, etc. So there's a whole bunch of support there as well. Questions regarding boot? All right, let's do a quick dive into Spring Cloud. So that's your forte.
Sure. So we spent a lot of time talking about Spring Boot, and Spring Cloud is another layer of the onion, if you will. It's on top of Spring Boot, which is on top of Spring Framework, among the other projects. Spring Cloud was sort of conceived as a way to make running Spring applications easier within cloud environments. And for those of you who aren't aware, Pivotal has a Cloud Foundry platform as a service, and obviously we want everything to play nicely together. But it's not just for Cloud Foundry. We're talking about Heroku potentially, or Amazon. But obviously Cloud Foundry is there for us to play with as well. We saw that Netflix had open sourced a number of their libraries, and they're obviously very successful with what they're doing with microservices and some of the functionality that they use internally. And so we realized this would be really great to include and be able to incorporate within a Spring application. So Dave Sire and Spencer, two guys who actually work on the open source side of the Spring Cloud projects, they took those, they created abstractions on top of the Netflix libraries and created what Spring Cloud is today. Service discovery is essentially an abstraction around the Netflix Eureka library. What that does is it allows you to not have to hard code URLs to different services or applications within a multi-application or microservice, if you will, environment. So if you've got one service running over here and another one over here, these all register with Eureka, and your UI app could then register with Eureka as well. It goes and asks Eureka, well, where do I find the database service, or where do I find the email service, for example? And Eureka gives it back a route, but your applications, none of these services have to have a hard-coded URL within them. And so this means that you can more easily deploy your applications in flexible ways, because you don't have to go back and configure and change those settings. Circuit breaker is a design pattern, so it's as it sounds like. We all have circuit breakers in our houses, hopefully. So same thing applies for an application. Some really good examples of this are both Amazon and Netflix. The example that I always use is they've got like a list of favorites or something. So if you log into Amazon, it's got this sidebar like recommended items or recommendations. If, for example, the request to get that list of recommended items failed, then it would fall back to just sort of a generic list of things. And you may or may not recognize it because the web page hasn't blown up. You know, it still works, it's still providing you information. Some of the things may not look familiar or may look silly, but that's because they weren't able to hit the recommendation service, for example. Same thing might apply to Netflix. Maybe it couldn't pull up your list of items, your favorites, and so it shows you a generic list. So Spring Cloud offers you another one of the pieces of functionality within Spring Cloud is the circuit breaker support. We have excuse me, the circuit breaker support is built around the Netflix Hystrix library. That's the name of the library from Netflix. Client-side load balancing is based on another Netflix library called Ribbon. And actually, Eureka uses Ribbon internally to do all of its sort of negotiations for connecting to services. So you can actually have, each service could have multiple instances running, and Ribbon's going to help determine which one to go for a front-end UI application to go hit in the back end. So for example, there's a couple of different algorithms that it can use, but by default it's just going to use like a round robin. So if you've got like 4 different instances of your database service running, it's just going to kind of go through each of those. And Ribbon's going to help determine which one of those it should be hitting. Router and filtering is based on another Netflix. You're seeing a theme here, I'm sure. Another Netflix open source project called Zool. And this allows you, and coincidentally integrates very well with Eureka. It allows you to do intelligent proxying and routing, and I'm not going to do it justice in this 5-second description, but essentially lets you define some really customizable routes within your application. But what's really neat about that is that you can use the Eureka endpoints. You can use Eureka to help discover those proxied endpoints and those proxied routes. So again, that's obviously more complicated than what I'm describing right there, but it's quite powerful. Yes?
Is it sort of analogous to Apache Camel or something like that?
No.
Endpoints, routers, filters?
The cool thing about it is it lets you define the filters as previous scripts or other scripts. You just drop them in a directory, and all of a sudden some percentage of your traffic can be routed to a set of test servers, where you can route, looking at the cookies, everybody from this one client who's having a problem, direct them to servers that you've got every debug script turned on for. You delete the file, and a second later it drops the route, and everything's going back to the main set of servers. Operations folks just absolutely love that thing.
Yep. So this is more for more operations support than. However, this is what's really cool about this stuff. It's lightweight, that you can actually drop it in just your existing applications quite easily to reap some of the benefits. So even if you're not necessarily yet deploy this onto cloud environments, be it Cloud Foundry or whatever you have within the environment, just for some of the benefits of just even monitoring, right? I mean, you can literally have all your apps connected to Eureka, and you basically get immediate, and it's literally just an annotation basically, and you have Eureka running, you basically get immediate visibility into the services that you're running within your environment, including details of where they are, etc., and as well as some analytics basically on that.
Start with the circuit breaker. If you've ever had your entire site go down because your database server slowed down, go look at the circuit breaker, what it's got is timeouts, and after n milliseconds, it will stop routing, and it will literally stop all routes to the database server to let it wake up. Meanwhile, in the end user experience, you're getting some defaults back, but your whole site hasn't crashed. Once your database server recovers, every once in a while it sneaks a request through. If the requests start going through successfully, it opens up the channel again. So in the middle of the night, if something goes wrong with your backups and your database server gets loaded up, it's happened to all of us. The circuit breaker will detect that, slow everything down, not take the site out, but when the recovery happens, suddenly all the traffic starts down. Ops gets notified when the circuit breaker trips, but they don't wake up people because the database is down. So at a minimum, you got to play with something, go look at that circuit breaker.
Yeah, this stuff is actually, even like if you even take it yet even further simpler, like a use case would be, let's say in your apps, you may do RESTful services calls, right? Those services may just go down, right? I mean, may not be there. Wouldn't it be awesome if you had at least something like, well, if that service fails, call this other method that does something else you want to do, right? Be it notify somebody, or do some, at least blow up in a log file, do some interesting logging or whatever, some custom logic in there, or maybe even have a fallback method or whatever it is you want to act upon. Hystrix, same here. Enable Hystrix, literally just an annotation. Then in your service layer, you can literally just provide an annotation for Hystrix, declare a fallback method, if that method failed, it will call the other method. So so that's just a quick
and the auto recovery is the really cool part about it.
Yep.
Yeah. Build systems that if I can't reach the database, I just go into a download and return I'm down, I'm down, I'm down. Every once in a while, it'll sneak a request through because the service behind it is woken up now. It'll then send another, and then a third, and a fifth. You know, every fifth it'll try, every 10th it'll try. Yep. And when the service is up, it's going to open up the pipe again. So the problem of, oh God, which server's down? I've got 50 servers out there. It doesn't matter anymore because the circuit breaker detects who's been recovered and lets the traffic start routing. Again, Ops loves this. First, it gives the notifications of what's gone wrong, and it doesn't stack. You don't take your entire app out because everybody's starting to back up behind a set of requests. And then when you fix it, it's all auto recovery.
Also, so I've actually got this exact demo, and then I know we're starting to run a little short on time, but I wanted to run through it just as an example. So this first tab that I started up already is the Eureka application. It's a very vanilla Spring Boot application with a single annotation on it, which is @enable Eureka. Let's see if I can go find it. So enable Eureka server, which is right there. This is all the application is. Everything else is handled by Spring Cloud. And then I have a Hystrix dashboard, which is the same thing. It's @enable Hystrix dashboard. I've started that up in a second tab. And then I've got two Spring Boot, Spring MVC applications. One is called Numbers Service, which is going to be a backend service, and one is called just Numbers App. And these are very trivial, basic, but they really illustrate how this stuff works. So I'm going to start up the Numbers Service, and okay, I'm starting up both apps, and I'm assuming everything is working okay with my computer. What you can see down here, Discovery Client, Numbers Service. So this thing is actually communicating to the Eureka server right there. And if I go back over to the Eureka Service tab, you can see down here, registered, this guy, status up, numbers. So these apps are now communicating with the Eureka service.
Do you have the UI for Eureka?
I do, yep, somewhere. Okay, and
you still have the old UI. Yes. This is basically what happens if you do keynote-driven development. Last year, basically, we did a demo, and it was like, hey, slap in, provide some UI for Eureka. And so I took some of the, I was working on Spring XE at that time on that UI, so I skinned that over, and behold, it's used everywhere now. So I finally changed the logo on.
So you can see here we've got two applications that are registered with Eureka. This shows this thing in the parentheses is showing the number of instances on those, and then down on the end you can actually click in and see it. It takes you to a Spring Boot actuator info. Oops, I really made it close up. Okay, so I can show you guys how this actually, how the circuit breaker stuff is actually going to work. Okay. So I'm just going to start off a while loop right here. So I've got a Spring MVC application, and it's making a request to the number service, and the number service is just giving it a new number. So every time it asks for it, it gives it a new number. And if I come over here and then stop the number service, oh, of course. I stopped the wrong one. So I stopped the front end and not the back end. You stop the front end, your whole application will actually die. Okay, so you can see here that it's returning 0, and this is the fallback, the Hystrix fallback method. And over here, you can, again, wrong tab, but you can see that the number service is not actually running. And now if I restart that guy, he's going to go re-register with Eureka. And then eventually we will start getting the numbers back once the Eureka heartbeats all sync up and the front-end application is able to see it. So you saw it just jump right there, and you can see the register with Eureka. So if we give it another few seconds, then the front-end UI will actually see that guy. Eventually.
Never work with animals, children, or live IQ.
I know. You don't. Eventually. Gunnar saw me doing this at his house. Yeah, there it goes. Okay. So that's a demo of the circuit breaker and Eureka. Very simple demo. And just to show you what the code looks like real quick. If you come down here, we've got just a very basic, again, Spring Boot application. Enable Discovery Client and enable Circuit Breaker. Discovery Client is sort of the generic annotation for Eureka. I've got a controller, and that's the one that we're calling, that I'm calling from that curl command. And right here, we've got number helper, and this guy is going to be a component. And here's where some of the Hystrix magic happens. So we've got a default number, which is defaults back to 0. And this is what's really interesting. So do you see this guy right here, this HTTP number service? I mentioned that you don't hard code URLs into your application. Well, that's the name of the service that's registered with Eureka. So Spring Cloud translates that for you. So you type in the name, you put in the name of the logical name of the service, number service, instead of having to know that it's on localhost in whatever port. And Eureka goes and finds that and then gives the application back that actual address.
And that also provides some load balancing. So if you have multiple services, the same service registered multiple times with the Eureka, it will actually go round robin through those services.
Yeah, exactly. So if I fired up like 4 different instances, Eureka would go through via ribbon. It would go through and pick the round robin algorithm by default, but you can specify different ones. So this is really the main feature of the Hystrix, is this fallback method right there. So what's going to happen here is that get for object is going to throw an exception because it can't reach that endpoint on that service. And when that happens, then this annotation is going to say, okay, we'll just call this get default number. And there it is, this default number down here, which we've specified up at the top as 0. And actually, this is this add value annotation. I'm using this. This is something that I haven't gone over yet, but Spring Cloud also offers an external configuration, and by that I mean you can store a properties file or YAML file in a GitHub repository, and all of your applications that are utilizing that external configuration will pull all that into the application, and then those properties via the environment stuff that Gunnar talked about earlier will get exposed to your application. So if I was using that, I could specify this default number in a properties file somewhere else. In fact, I did actually do that. So I created just an empty repository on GitHub, sample external configuration, and then I've got default number -1.
And you should not host your security stuff publicly on GitHub. So just
no, absolutely not. Absolutely not. So the external configuration support in Spring Cloud supports authentication. We support Subversion as well as a local GitHub repository. So the security is already in place in there. That's it's just easier to demo.
So you can even like have like also like beyond just you can also have encryption stuff within your repo as well for certain properties that are those their support for that.
Yeah, if you mark it in as encrypted, it'll actually encrypt it out there, but when it sends it to your app and it sets the property locally, it'll decrypt it at that time.
Let's see, so the number service itself, again, enable discovery client, so it's registering with Eureka. And again, this is just a simple Spring Boot application. We've got a number endpoint here, which is what we looked at here. We're going to that number endpoint, endpoint. Just a standard POJO object that we're returning. So all a very basic application. We've got it's essentially two different Spring MVC applications, but you've got the circuit breaker acting in between, and it creates a fallback for you.
And so if you want to take it to the next level, in the notes I will also put the links to actually what we did as for our keynote presentation at Spring 1, where we actually had like a slur of a whole bunch of different services where we actually created live traffic, kind of like simulated traffic data, routed that to different microservices where we managed service locations, looked those up, etc., and then eventually they were streamed via WebSockets onto a moving map. And they showcase a couple of similar to those things and how to manage those as microservices in your application. I put those notes in there. Unfortunately, we didn't have really the time to show that. But
so the one last thing I did want to show you, this is a dashboard on Cloud Foundry. I showed you that I had to build, and obviously it's not very complicated because it was just one single annotation to create a Eureka server and also a Hystrix server. But within Cloud Foundry, we're working on a project called Spring Cloud Services. It enables some of these features so that you don't even have to build any of that stuff. It also does auto configuration, so you don't even have to do the stuff in your client application that you would normally have to do on an OSS Spring Cloud implementation. We've got services that you can just drop into your space. I'm using some terms that you may not be familiar with on Cloud Foundry, but we've got what we call an organization and a space within Cloud Foundry where you can deploy applications. And you can see right here I've got the numbers and the number service both running. And these three services down here, service registry, circuit breaker dashboard, and config server, those are all things that we provide within Cloud Foundry so that you don't even have to build and deploy those as individual applications. And let's see, that's about it. So I think we're pretty much out of time.
And we are over the time.
Way over.
But I hope with this presentation we gave you at least a glimpse. I mean, literally we scratched the surface. I mean, could like, just on the Spring Cloud stuff itself, we could probably fill out an entire day of stuff. Not because it's complicated, but just because there's so much cool stuff in there. That you got a glimpse of what the Spring portfolio is and what new things out there. Hopefully you have some pointers to experiment with, to play with, discover new things. I put slides out there later tonight, a couple of links as well. We had, just if you need resources, where's the slides? Just to, I put this all.
Where'd they go?
There. Here we go. Demo. We're supporting JUnit, so that's out there. Pivotal and DevNexus. We actually are JUnit supporters, so support open source. Yay. And there are a couple of books out there for Cloud Native. This one is a free book you can get on the Pivotal website. Cloud Native Java. There are books on Spring Boot out there if you need resources. Get the Spring Developer YouTube channel. If you want to watch a week straight of videos, right out there. Should get you up to date, most of the stuff. If you're coming to DevNexus, we have Matt Stein. He is an awesome presenter. He came to Spring User Group a few months ago. I don't know, a few months ago. Yep. Talked about lots of the Spring Cloud stuff there. He's doing a full-day workshop on this stuff, so check that out. That's really great stuff.
Yeah, Matt's actually my product manager and just super knowledgeable guy. He's very in tune with a lot of what our customers are trying to do, and so he's got a lot his head's full of knowledge. So really great guy.
So with that, have fun, play with this stuff, give feedback if you have any questions. Stack Overflow, there's all kinds of stuff always answered. So thank you so much for coming. If you have any questions, because of time, come out. We're around here for a little longer, answering any questions you may have. So thank you so much for coming. Yep.